Colleagues, we need to broaden this effort. Now is the time for a coalition of like-minded partners to step up and step in with real capabilities and help. We need for commercial shipping, for maritime finance and insurance, for humanitarian aid agencies, over 80 of which move their humanitarian supplies through this strait for life-saving aid, in addition to the military assets, to come together in a coalition for maritime freedom.
Lasting stability and security in the Persian Gulf and the wider region can only be achieved through a durable and permanent cessation of aggression against Iran, supplemented by credible guarantees of non-recurrence and full respect for the legitimate sovereign rights and interests of Iran.
At the UN, Trump's envoy is reportedly begging for help from allies as Iran appears to gain the upper hand in the Strait of Hormuz. Iran and USA envoys engaged in a fiery clash during the UNSC session on maritime security, sharply escalating tensions. The world is weighing in on the broader debate over maritime security at the UNSC, as the dispute draws in more countries. The blockade stalemate is dragging on, with America claiming that Iran is taking the world hostage in the standoff. Then, the US is reportedly begging allies for help against Iran, raising questions about whether Trump's siege strategy has failed. Tehran has struck back, putting the onus on the aggressor USA and rejecting Washington's claims. More than 30 Iran-linked vessels have reportedly bypassed the US blockade, underscoring the scale of the challenge at sea. The US has intercepted at least 8 Iran-linked vessels and seized 2 so far, according to the latest reports.
The world's critical waterways are not bargaining chips that belong to any one country. And now, maritime transit routes, which are truly the arteries of global commerce, that roughly 80% of global trade by volume moves through such waterways, they are too vital. They're too important to all of us collectively as a global community to be choked off, to be mined, to be weaponized, to be attacked like two-bit pirates. Because when they are, the entire world pays the price, and the world is paying. Most countries, far more than the United States, they are paying for Iran's hostage-taking gambit in the Strait of Hormuz. So let's take a moment and look at the numbers. The Strait of Hormuz typically sees 20 million barrels of oil per day, 40,000 vessels per year. And whether they're bound to heat homes in East Asia or to nourish crops in Central Africa, they have 20% of global oil and liquefied natural gas, 15% of the world's fertilizers. They all transit this strait. And closer to home, it's responsible for 75% of our Gulf states' partners' economic output and over 50% of the broader region's food. It is absolutely clear, it's unambiguous, that as a matter of international law, this strait is not, despite Iran's foreign minister's claims, this strait is not Iran's to wield like its own moat and drawbridge. It is not Iran's hostage. It is not Iran's bargaining chip. It is not Iran's toll road. And that's what over 100 countries right outside these doors just testified in one of the most supported press conferences in recent years. 100 countries just said what I said. This is not for Iran to play with like some type of bargaining chip because of its illegal nuclear aspirations. Colleagues, less than 3 weeks ago, the world came together to counter this threat to maritime security. The Security Council adopted UN Security Council Resolution 2817 with a record-setting 136 co-sponsors, demanding that Iran cease its egregious attacks against its neighboring states. Regardless of what you feel about the ongoing conflict, it has chosen to shoot in all directions against its neighbors' civilian infrastructures. And the entire world condemned the obstruction of freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has done nothing but act in defiance of that resolution. 40 days and counting, they have laid sea mines, they have fired on civilian ships. We have worked to clear the sea mines and protect these ships, but it's used the strait also to launch thousands of missiles at Gulf capitals, their hospitals, their airports, their hotels, their neighborhoods. They have threatened to charge tolls, otherwise known as bribes, to allow ships to pass through the strait. And in true form, they have still tried to kill even more Americans than they have in the last 47 years. And this is why President Trump has directed firm action against Iran's threats in the maritime domain to safeguard the entire world's economic security and prosperity. And even while under this type of assault, this type of fire, thousands of drones and missiles pouring in, Bahrain and a coalition of Gulf states put forward another resolution to protect the freedom of navigation and maritime security in the Straits of Hormuz. But unfortunately, two countries, China and Russia, vetoed this resolution and chose a radical religious regime for its partner and ignored not only the plight of our Gulf countries, but the global economy. They chose to shield the Iranian regime from a common sense measure, and they chose to turn a blind eye against Iran's assault on the freedom of navigation, which is hard to make sense of given it's the economies of East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and East Africa that are most affected by this illegal assault on shipping. So unfortunately, these two countries have put their own economic interest ahead of international obligations. Their companies and citizens supported the Iran-backed Houthis, in addition, in waging a 2-year campaign of terror against shipping in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, which before this crisis was one of the most disruptive assaults on maritime commerce in recent history. Ultimately, colleagues, this council must hold the Iranian regime to account for this blatant and occurring violation of international law, violations of the UN Charter, violations of binding Security Council sanctions, and violations of other measures that were snapped back into place in September. Violations of its own non-proliferation obligations, as we just had a non-proliferation gathering here in the General Assembly. Violations of its obligations under the law of the sea. Violations of the law of war. Violations of international humanitarian and human rights law. But I want to particularly spend a moment on the sea mining and indiscriminate planting of mines in international waterways. That makes Iran the international criminal, pirates of the Straits. Tehran admits to these crimes, but is so incompetent, it also admits to not knowing where the mines are. Thankfully, the U.S. military is stepping in to clear these mines and make it safe. But colleagues, we need to broaden this effort. Now is the time for a coalition of like-minded partners to step up and step in with real capabilities and help. We need for commercial shipping, for maritime finance and insurance, for humanitarian aid agencies, over 80 of which move their humanitarian supplies through this strait for life-saving aid, in addition to the military assets, to come together in a coalition for maritime freedom. As the permanent representative of Pakistan just mentioned, we've come together before. We came together in CTF 151 to deal with piracy off the straits, or off East Africa in the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb. The United Nations was built for times like this. We have been here before. We have allowed unchecked regimes and non-state actors to loudly tiptoe towards horrors against their neighbors, while much of the rest of the world sat back and watched. Colleagues, now is not the time for simple words. Now is the time to act. And we call upon the world to join us in maintaining and defending the freedom of navigation for the entire world's economy. I thank you.
In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, Mr. President, since 28 February, the United States and the Israeli regime have waged an unwarranted large-scale war of aggression against Iran in flagrant violation of international law and the United Nations Charter, particularly Article 2, disrupting maritime security and freedom of navigation and threatening regional and international peace and security. The Strait of Hormuz has been increasingly utilized to support military attacks in the region, including the transfer of military equipment intended for hostile action against Iran. This militarization has exposed international shipping to heightened and unprecedented risk of Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. In the meantime, the United States has continued its internationally wrongful act by imposing maritime blockade, unlawfully seizing Iranian commercial vessels and detaining their crews. These dangerous escalating measures violate international law, breach the UN Charter, constitute the crime of piracy and amount of act of aggression as defined in Article 3 of the General Assembly Resolution 3314. Mr. President, as the principal coastal states which the Strait of Hormuz lies within its territorial seas, Iran has taken necessary and practical measures consistent with international law to address emerging threats for safe and secure navigation, maintain the continuous passage of vessels, and prevent misuse of this vital waterway for hostile or military purposes. These measures are grounded in Iran's right and obligation under the law of the seas and its national laws and regulations, with a view to striking an appropriate balance between the security interest and the coastal states and the continued safe conduct of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz in a highly volatile environment. These practical measures will be carefully examined in light of the evolving circumstances. Iran is not a party to the 1982 Convention on the Law of the Sea. Accordingly, it is not bound by its treaty-based provisions, except to extend the specific rules reflected therein and universally recognized as customary international law. Lasting stability and security in the Persian Gulf and the wider region can only be achieved through a durable and permanent cessation of aggression against Iran, supplemented by credible guarantees of non-recurrence and full respect for the legitimate sovereign rights and interests of Iran. In conclusion, I categorically reject the allegation made against my country at today's meeting. Claims made by some delegation lack any legal basis. They serve only to divert attention from realities on the ground and the commission of an internationally wrongful act by the United States and its allies. Those delegations have once again exposed the double standards, demonstrating that their concerns for maritime safety and navigation is neither genuine nor consistent with their actions and positions. They assert the navigational rights must not be threatened, but deliberately ignore the United States' unlawful action, including the imposition of maritime blockade and its recent terrorist attack on Iran's commercial vessels, the conduct that bears the hallmarks of piracy and hostage-taking, and act like a pirate and terrorist group. Certain delegations have also misused this council by deviating from the agenda, aligning themselves with the aggressors and raising irrelevant and unrelated issues in today's discussions. Mr. President, the responsibility for any disruption, obstruction, or other interference with the maritime transport in the Persian Gulf, Gulf of Oman, and the Strait of Hormuz lies directly with the aggressors, the United States and its supporters, whose unlawfully and destabilizing action have heightened tensions and endangered maritime safety and freedom of navigation. I thank you.